Because I Could Not Stop for Death is one of Emily Dickinson's best known and most widely anthologized poems, along with, perhaps, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? Hope is a Thing with Feathers. Like so much of her work, this poem appeals to a wide range of readers, young and old, from children to English professors, poets and non-poets, literati and ordinary people. Even so, if you ask a selection of her fans to say what they see and hear in this poem, you'll get some surprisingly different answers. Perhaps it bears further looking into. Let's start by reading through the poem together. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Questions arise. First, let's take a look at what may be two unfamiliar words, tippet and tool. Just about any short-length garment for covering the shoulders could be called a tippet, which would be welcome in the chill described in this poem. But her tippet, that of the speaker of this poem, is of the fine gossamer fabric known as tulle, not sufficient against the chill, and she feels it. The mood has shifted in this verse, as we've gone from a stately, pleasant carriage ride into something less comfortable. But there are more challenging questions than these. Who's driving? I explained earlier that different readers differ widely in what they may see and hear in this poem, and I should add in many other Dickinson poems as well. Here, for example, are 4 different scholars answering the question, who's driving? Richard Volney Chase in 1951 wrote, "Death is apparently a successful citizen who has amorous but genteel intentions. He is also God." Robert Goffin in 1964 wrote, "He is not deaf, but, quote, the loved man," unquote. This fictitious rendezvous with the eternal principle is made possible by the fact that, for the poet, love embraces immortality. Martha Winburn England in 1965 offers this, "That obliging gentleman who stops for her is no wooer. He is the village undertaker." And in 1969, Cora Kaplan, "The dream," she thinks it's a dream, "is a secondary frame for a poem in which the primary convention is a classical or a medieval reference to death as a driver, boatman, or charioteer." So, what or who do you see driving the chariot? What is this third presence in the carriage? Immortality. This poem is usually taken to be the poet speaking from beyond the grave, centuries after her death, saying how death one day bore her away in his carriage in very leisurely fashion, giving her opportunity to review her life before sunset, when she shivered in her thin clothes as she arrived at the burying ground. That seems strange, and some take it as a completely different point of view. For them, The day on which Emily first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity was the day, quite early in her life, on which it struck her that her mission was to devote her life to writing poems about death and immortality. She was brought to understand that the subject for her poems was the truth that all events of life should be seen in the light of death and immortality. That could explain why she seems quite willing to accept the ride and get into the carriage. Still, other Dickinson scholars feel that if she had intended the poem to mean that, she would have made it clearer, and that a less extreme alternative to the conventional view is that the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity was the day on which it struck her for the first time that her life must inevitably culminate in death and immortality. Different people read different meanings into the ambiguous third passenger, immortality. The questions abound. Can grain gaze? At what? Perhaps it's figurative. Dickinson knew innately that something could feel true without making literal sense. Then again, she may have been familiar with an odd bit of Southern folklore that holds that stalks of grain passed on the way to the burying ground gaze out from the fields upon the passing funeral procession. It's mysterious, and this line is often misread as grazing grain, because at least there's some association between those two words. It's mysterious, and the mood is about to shift a little further. Earlier editors deleted this fourth stanza. I invite you to pause the video here to ponder why they might have done that. This is the stanza where she first feels the chill. Up to this point, it seemed a leisurely, pleasant ride, hasn't it? Those early editors may simply have felt that the poem was more suitable to 19th century tastes without this disturbing stanza where, with a sudden change in meter, Dickinson brings us up short. Don't go away. You may find a brief look at the meter here quite revealing. This is known as common meter, and Dickinson employed it, or some form of it, in the great majority of her poems. She found it, among lots of other places, in her church hymnal, and so it is also called hymn meter sometimes. She heard these hymns from an early age and throughout her life. In the first line, you see 8 syllables. You can also call it 4 beats, because if you exaggerate, it sounds, because I could not stop for death. In the second line, it's 6 syllables, 3 beats. In the next 2 lines, the pattern repeats to complete the first stanza. Now, as I said, you'll find variations on this form throughout her work. And if you pause the video here and read through the subsequent stanzas, you'll find that in this poem, each one is in perfect common meter until we hit stanza 4 again, which, recall, early editors omitted. And again, perhaps it was the shift in mood that prompted them to do it. On the other hand, poetry in 19th century America, Walt Whitman accepted, was quite conventional in terms of rhyme and meter. And here we have a violation of conventional form. Was it that was their main objection to this stanza? Actually, probably not. The early editors could have done just as they had with much of her other work, rewritten it in more conventional form. Let's take a closer look. Note here the violation of our 8-6-8-6 common meter. Here we have 6886. Had the early editors wanted, they could have, and surely would have, changed it by taking 2 offending syllables from the second line and transposing them to the first. Voila! Perfect common meter. It reads the same. Or rather, he passed us, the dews drew quivering and chill. The point is, Dickinson could have done this too. She didn't, intentionally. The reader is rolling along in a steady carriage ride until she hits this unexpected missed beat. Right at the moment the speaker of the poem senses a change of atmosphere. And so, the very structure of the verse itself recreates within the reader a semblance of the experience itself. Too often, when Dickinson did something brilliantly creative, 19th century readers thought it must be a mistake. One technique she used to get the effect of a steady, even-paced carriage ride is the repeated, we passed, we passed, we passed, but now we've paused before, well, what is it? Before mechanized means were available to break through the frozen winter ground, bodies were stored in an unheated tomb within the cemetery. A concrete room covered with soil and planted with grass was used to store bodies during the cold of winter until the ground thawed and could be opened for the burial. In Amherst, where the poet lived all her life, the town tomb is still there in West Cemetery, just as it was when she was alive. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since she only paused at this singular house, presumably she continued on. As it's most often interpreted, this poem is a recollection of her journey from a point sometime after her own death. But the poet doesn't actually tell us how her journey ended. To some readers, the words, "I first surmised," in the final stanza, are a clue that the speaker of this poem is still on the journey towards eternity. The same journey that you and I are on. Well, if you're still with me and like what you've seen and heard, you might also like my book, published in 2018 from McFarland Publishers. I wrote this book for non-academics to be as, quote, accessible, unquote, as I could possibly make it. Check it out.